time, which is bad. So, all right, today we are going to have the Allies advance in the South and Central Pacific. That's from 1943 to June of 1944. As you can see, we have gone back to being chronological after last week's presentation that was not. So let us get started. Well, I like to look at 1943 as I refer to it as the year of gathering strength. And we've seen, because of what was going on in the Solomon Islands, particularly in all those huge naval battles between carriers, that by this time, most of these units are pretty much exhausted. And so the year of 1943, there will be no major carrier battles. There will be no carrier versus carrier efforts at all. Of course, there will still be naval battles. Those will primarily take place in the Solomons, but major carrier battles, none at all until June of 1944. What we will see, though, is the United States is able to build up its forces quicker than the Japanese, as that will be part of this, big part of the early part of this class. So what's really going on at this point is we're continuing to see MacArthur try to advance up the coast of New Guinea, up the northern coast, trying to get the Japanese further and further away from Australia. He will be using primarily Australian troops to do this. And that is the thrust early in the year. But we'll also see later in the year that Nimitz and the Central Command will also become a part of this. So indeed, Halsey in the Southern Pacific area and the Solomons is continuing that advance as well. But now we're going to see something completely different, where we're going to try to advance up the middle of the Pacific. And you'll see that in those blue lines in the center there. And the idea here is, again, it's War Plan Orange. The goal is to move across the Pacific, build air bases that are in range of the next objective, and then continue to move on and on and on. Well, of course, the Japanese plan was to prevent that, and that was to use these islands as unsinkable aircraft carriers. And of course, they had built the capability previous to World War II to have aircraft that would do that job. So those would be perhaps the Betty bomber, the Nell bomber. We saw these being very, very effective early in the war, sinking the HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales off Singapore. So the Japanese had a plan that we'd never really had, which was to use land-based naval air power. But there's going to be a problem with this, is they're not going to be able to support these islands. So their unsinkable aircraft carrier thought process is going to not work out for them. So, and we'll see that as we go on this class. Well, November of 1943, the United States has pretty much begun to gather its strength. And they're going to begin this advance through the Central Pacific. And we talked about, again, War Plan Orange, and you can see on this map that big red circle is where Truk Atoll is, and it contains the very key naval base or air base on the island of Baisio. So the idea is going to be, we're going to take the island of Baisio and we're going to then use that air base for our own further advance, particularly in the Gilberts and the Marshalls and the Carolines as we continue to move forward. Well, this is going to be a really large force to capture this little island. So we look at what we have capability here. In November 43, we have 6 fleet carriers. We have 5 Independence-class light carriers. We have a bunch of CVEs. Those are escort carriers. We're going to have 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, and they're going to have 36 transports transporting 35,000 troops. Now, these 35,000 troops will primarily consist of the 2nd Marine Division, and we'll also have a significantly large contingent of the U.S. Army at this point with the 27th Infantry Division, not the entire division, but a good portion of it. And they're going to try to capture not just Baisio, but Macon Island as well. Well, so if we look at a map of Baisio, we can see that this little island is basically all it is an airstrip. It's not very large. The airstrip basically covers the entire island. So that is going to be the objective of capturing this thing. So when we look at the Japanese piece, and they realize that they have yet to rebuild their forces from 1942, they decide they are not going to try to stop this invasion. And so that puts these people without naval support completely on their own. So the Japanese on this island basically are already cut off because of our naval power. Well, what Japanese forces are on this island? These people are what's known as Special Naval Landing Force troops. These are in effect Japanese Marines. They're structured to do similar things to what our Marines do, which is capture islands, make beach landings, etc. These are very specialized troops. There's 2,200 workers on this island. Those are primarily Koreans. So you can see there's a relatively large contingent on this island. The island has begun to become fortified. This is the Japanese outer defense perimeter. They want to hold these islands because of these air bases so they can destroy our fleet as it moves across the Pacific. That's always their goal. So what's on that island? They've got 4 big 8-inch guns. They've got 50 artillery pieces, and those artillery pieces are, many of those are anti-aircraft guns. But anti-aircraft guns are extremely effective at destroying landing craft. Another piece they've got in 14 little light tanks. So you wouldn't think on an island this side that, but they indeed deployed 14 light tanks. And they're going to fortify this island with a lot of bunkers. Well, remembering last week's class, I talked about how the Japanese ability, our submarines reduced the Japanese ability to defend islands. This is the only case I can think of where indeed our submarines actually hurt our abilities to take an island. Now, why would I say that? Simply this, is that the force on that island, that Special Naval Landing Force, those 2,600 guys, they're a really high quality specialized unit. And the Japanese did not want to use them, particularly the Japanese Navy, to use these guys just to defend an island. So they were going to be replaced by 800 or 900 regular Japanese infantry. So there's a ship coming in with these Japanese infantry to replace these guys and take them off the island. We sink that ship. So now instead of fighting 800 guys, we're going to fight 2,600. Another interesting thing occurs too in regards to them being able to get things they wanted to make this place more defensible. For example, there was a ship carrying a lot of concrete. That ship is sunk by our submarines. So the Japanese have to improvise now because they cannot build fortifications like they wanted to, so they'll use coconut logs. Well, coconut logs are surprisingly effective as bunkers because they're very fibrous. So the Japanese will make their bunkers out of massive amounts of coconut logs and then cover these up with sand. So this is a very, very well-defended island. Should have been less well-defended, but again, it's the only time I can ever remember where our submarines actually were detrimental to our ability to take something. Well, we're going to begin to bombard the island, and the United States Navy really hasn't perfected bombardment yet. So they decide, well, it's a little bitty island. This is no problem. So we're going to bombard it for 3 hours. Well, they begin to bombard it for 3 hours, and the battleships are standing way off, and they're lobbing 14 and 16-inch shells at this little island. And a lot of the shells actually miss the island. They go over the top of the island and land in the water. So a 3-hour bombardment is not going to be effective against knocking out all these Japanese positions, even on a little tiny island like this. And the fact that we haven't perfected this technology is a problem. One thing we do finally, and this is critical to this battle, is our destroyers begin to get much closer to the island and begin to use direct fire with their 5-inch guns. We'll see this is really going to make a difference here. Well, the Marines are going to use 2 different types of landing craft. They're going to use the brand new Amtrak, which we would look at that as a armored personnel carrier. So basically, it's able to go in the water, and then it's got tracks. It can then crawl up onto the beach and just, get its troops out on the beach, and that can actually begin to be used as a fighting vehicle of limited capability. Yes.
Is that a front opening or like a Higgins boat, or they go over the side or out the back?
The original version of the Amtrak did not have a rear opening. It is later developed to have a rear opening because they realize that's a lot safer for the troops that you're carrying. But the original version, which these are, would not be built that way. But that also brings up, I'm glad you mentioned that, brings up the Higgins boat, which most of you are probably familiar with from D-Day. You see numerous versions of these, where indeed that's a shallow draft boat that's designed to run up on the shore, and then its gate drops open and the troops run out. That was built by Andrew Higgins in New Orleans. And if you ever go to the National World War II Museum, you'll see that Mr. Higgins is prominently featured in that facility. So again, two different types. Well, what's going to happen here is that the use of the Higgins boats was supposed to be that there would be launched at high tide, because Batio and Tarawa Atoll are completely surrounded by a coral reef. So the idea is there's going to be 5 feet of water going over that reef. And what the Navy doesn't really think through properly is the fact that this time of year, there's something called a neap tide. And the neap tide is much, much shallower. So what's going to happen is they're going to get these Higgins boats, which are carrying the bulk of the Marine force. They're not going to be able to get over that reef. So they're going to be stuck 400 yards out in the water. Well, the Japanese are looking at this going, this is great, okay? Because this is, you know, they've totally they don't know what's going on here because they can't get their boats over that reef. So we're going to slaughter these guys. And the Japanese are then, unfortunately for them, very, very surprised when all of a sudden the Amtraks begin to just crawl over the reef and disgorge our troops onto the beach. So that is a major issue now. So we've got this problem where only so many Marines are landing on this beachhead because of this neap tide, which the Navy completely messes up. Well, so the Japanese defenses are pretty strong still because of the lack of bombardment. And 50% of those Amtraks are destroyed in the first day. So now you've got this situation where you've got the only way you can get your troops in is either to send what Amtraks you have left and bring them in a few at a time, or you can begin to have them wade in to the shore 400 yards. Now, any of you that have walked in water realize that's not exactly a fast way to get anywhere. Also, there's no place to hide. So this is going to greatly increase U.S. casualties because of basically poor planning on the part of the Navy. So Japanese are, you know, it's touch and go. It's the best way I can put it. So by nightfall, the Marines only have this little tiny landing because they can't get their troops in. And the Japanese, the plan at this point in the war is always for the Japanese to launch an immediate counterattack, particularly at night, because that's why there are less casualties for them because they don't have the firepower we have. And they're going to basically try to drive us into the ocean. So, you know, basically totally defeat the landing with a counterattack. Problem happens for the Japanese, though. Remember I had said we have these destroyers that are now very close range and are using direct fire on the Japanese positions. Well, the Japanese have a large command bunker, and they're starting to get a lot of casualties. And the commanders of the force on Tarawa decide, hey, we're going to use this big command bunker as a hospital, and we're going to transfer to a smaller bunker. In the process of transferring to that smaller bunker, a 5-inch shell from one of our destroyers lands in the midst of their unit. Basically their leadership is decapitated. So now at that evening, when they would have had a pretty good chance to perhaps drive us into the sea, they never have the coordination that they would have had if their command force hadn't been wiped out. So that is a huge advantage for the United States at this point. So again, they never launch a coordinated counterattack that they perhaps could have had they not been decapitated by that artillery shell. And the Japanese are always going to have this problem now. And we see this at D-Day too, where our destroyers will come in really close and will bust up these counterattacks or help our troops get ashore by direct fire. And direct fire from a 5-inch gun is pretty useful. So again, that is a major, major problem for the Japanese. And yes.
Close is close. When the ships come in close enough to fire, how close is that?
The question to everybody is how close do the destroyers get to shore? And the simplest question is that depends on two things. The first thing is how deep is the water? Okay, so if the water is particularly deep, you can get in really close. If the water is not particularly deep, that certainly limits your ability to get destroyers in close. You see at D-Day, for example, our ships were actually scraping their bottom on the French coast. They had gotten in that close. Now, again, can I quantify that in direct amount of yardage? No, because it depends on the situation. But they get in as close as they possibly can, and it also depends on how much direct fire they're taking from enemy positions as well. But again, they get in close enough where they are firing visually. Okay.
They're not that long where they can.
No, they're firing visually. They're that close. So that's a key problem for the Japanese. So we're always able, because of that, to bust up their assaults at Germans as well. And you can see on this picture, I think this is pretty incredible. You can see 3 Amtraks that are destroyed on the beach, and there's actually a Japanese tank on the beach that was part of the counterattack. So you can see the Japanese made a major effort here to push us back into the sea if they actually have a tank on the beach. Because that was, so again, this was a really close run thing for at least the first day. Because of that neap tide. And we do actually at some point, I believe it's in the second day, we actually decide to have the Marines wade in that 400 yards, and they take a lot of casualties. Well, so this battle goes on for 3 days for this one little island. And only 17 Japanese Marines, SNLFs, Special Naval Landing Force, are taken prisoner. Most of these people are wounded. They take 129 of those Korean laborers captive as well. So you can see that the losses for the Japanese are incredibly high. And of course, that is what I always refer to as their cult of death. Well, when we look at this, though, as far as U.S. casualties, we have 1,696 killed in action. That's a lot. 2,101 wounded. And many of these people are lost on the Liscum Bay, that escort carrier I talked about last week, the one that had Doris Miller, the African-American hero from Pearl Harbor, where he is killed on this ship. And again, though, that is a major, major issue as far as the Japanese are concerned, because they don't have the capability to protect these islands with their fleet, to have the air power they need to really do what they wanted to do with these islands. So the loss of this island and the way it is lost just goes to show you that their idea of unsinkable aircraft carriers is not going to work out. Well,
did we have any aircraft that took part in this?
Oh yeah, we had them off the coast on carriers. So we had 6 CVs and et cetera. So all those aircraft are bombing as well, as much as they can in this little island. Well, what I want to talk about next is I mentioned that there was an Army contingent to this. And that Army contingent was to take Macon Island. And Macon Island is right by Tarawa. And the Army has a completely different idea of how to fight. And I'm not saying one's right or wrong, okay, just so we could clarify that. But the Marines are built to assault fortified positions. So they are designed to fight against a frontal attack. The United States Army, of course, is built to do land battles on big, like on Europe, for example. And their whole goal is to use flanking attacks, to use artillery and tanks, et cetera, to reduce casualties in that regard, because they don't want to launch frontal assaults. Okay, but the Marines, of course, what they're designed to do, they have to launch frontal assaults. They don't have an option. You're going in a beach, you're going in a beach. So The Macon Atoll, a force on the Japanese side is about 800 troops. Again, it's a little island. And the Army is going to land basically a regiment and some attached units as well from this division. And it doesn't go the way they want it to go. There's no way they can launch really flank attacks. They have kind of a convoluted plan. And the Japanese, of course, are going to fight to the death. So this doesn't go as quickly as it was hoped, which very rarely do any of these invasions do that. But it doesn't go as fast as it was hoped to it. So it takes 3 days to conquer Macon Island. Well, the person that's in charge of this force, the total force of land troops, is a gentleman named Holland Smith. He's a Marine general. And Holland Smith becomes infuriated with the behavior of the 27th Infantry Division. He states that the 27th Infantry Division should have conquered this island in 7 hours. Okay. He also states that one of their battalion commanders was killed and the Army troops did not recover his body for 3 days. That is completely untrue. That's just, I don't know where he made this up from. But the fact is, there's records to show that that body was recovered within an hour and then it was buried the next day. So his body wasn't laying out there for 3 days. But Holland Smith hates the Army. Let's put it the simply way I can put it. And so he now makes the claim that the Liscum Bay, that escort carrier that's sunk by a Japanese submarine, the reason that it's sunk is because the Army took so long to capture that island. And his rationale is this, and there is a rationale. Okay, because the aircraft carriers never want to hang off an island for too long in one spot because they become prey to submarines. We've seen that at Guadalcanal with the loss of the Wasp. We've seen that with the Saratoga being torpedoed off of Guadalcanal. So indeed, the Navy doesn't really want carriers hanging around in one spot for too long. They want them to be mobile, always do. But to say that, and remember, Macon Island is right by Tarawa. It's not like they're like 1,000 miles apart. So if the Marines took 3 days to take Tarawa, 3 days to take Macon, it really blows his argument. But he believes fully that this loss of this escort carrier is the fault of the United States Army. So we will explore this further as this course goes on. But indeed, keep that in mind that there's this feud going on. Well, let's look at the map first here, and this is called Operation Cartwheel. And I talked a little bit about this before, but let's just refresh it. In the blue circle on the right side there is where Guadalcanal is. That's Halsey's command. That's the South Pacific Command. And his goal was to march up from Guadalcanal to go up the Solomon Islands chain and get closer to Rabaul. We see the big circle to the left, the big blue circle. That is where MacArthur has his command. And indeed, that is designed to go up the coast of New Guinea to get closer and closer to New Britain and Rabaul. And eventually, they are going to capture Rabaul. That's the whole idea of this plan. And MacArthur, the bulk of his troops are going to be from Australia and New Zealand. So, and those people, like I said, they want to make sure the Japanese get a lot further away from Australia. So that's their goal here. So what's going to happen here, though, of course, is for the Japanese, is the Japanese are very, very afraid that we're going to begin to march up the coast of New Guinea and get closer and closer to the southern resource area and to the Philippines. And that will allow us to use air power to cut that line. So we saw in the Guadalcanal presentation that on January 4th of 43, the Japanese have decided they can't support Guadalcanal anymore, the Japanese army. What they're now going to do is they're going to do everything they can to prevent our advance in New Guinea. And as I've talked to numerous times, New Guinea is a terrible place to fight. But they need now to reinforce New Guinea, and they're going to send 6,900 troops in. So let's look at the map carefully so we really can understand this. The large blue circle up at the top right is where Rabaul is on the island of New Britain. The yellow circle across from that is the town of Madang, which is a port. The blue circle next to the red circle is where the town of Leh is. And that's where they want to have their defensive position. The three black circles on the bottom are where we have air bases at Port Moresby, at Milne Bay, there we go, I spit it out. And of course, at Buna. So that if we look now at the line that's going from Rabaul, that is the line for this convoy. So they're going to stay north of New Britain to try to stay out of our range of air power and then rush down to get to Leh. Now, the reason they're going to do that is if they could land at Madang, it would be much safer. But then their troops have to go 140 miles through the jungle of New Guinea in order to get into position at Leh. And they're not going to do that. And then the big red circle in the middle is where this battle is basically going to take place. Well, they need to get to Leh, but by going to Leh, they're going to be within range of our air power. And that is a major problem for them. Well, the Japanese convoy is consisting of 8 troop transports for these 6,900 guys, and it's going to consist of 8 destroyers to defend them. And they're going to try to run in, drop these troops off, and then get out of Dodge as fast as they can. Well, as usual, the Japanese have a problem, is that we have broken their codes. So we are well aware that they are going to do this, that we know exactly, basically, on March 5th, this convoy is going to arrive at Leh, New Guinea. So we are going to make sure that we can do everything we can to prevent that from happening. Well, the first thing that happens is there's a long-range B-24, and it spots this convoy on the 1st, and they send in B-17s, and B-17s, amazingly to me, they managed to sink one of the transports using high altitude level bombing. High altitude level bombing is incredibly ineffective in World War II to sink ships. It just is. And I'm fairly impressed that they managed to even sink one of these, because basically these bombers rarely hit anything from high altitude. So they did sink one of the cargo ships. Well, then what's going to happen is when this convoy gets closer to Leh, it's going to become under major air attack from those 3 bases I mentioned. So, and that's going to be a continuous attack on the 3rd. Excuse me. So when we look at this, Allied anti-shipping tactics are going to have to change dramatically. When we saw the Navy units and the Marine units at Guadalcanal, they used particularly the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber to sink Japanese ships. The Army and the Royal Australian Army don't have a lot of dive bombers. They have a very small contingent of dive bombers, actually the Douglas Dauntless, which they referred to as the A-24 Banshee. But it's not going to be particularly used at this point, and they only had very few of these. So what they do have, though, is they have level bombers. Well, like I said, level bombers aren't particularly good at sinking ships. And the other thing is we've never developed, the United States has never developed our level bombers really to drop torpedoes like the Japanese did. So how are they going to sink these ships? Well, they're going to use a new tactic. They're going to use the tactic of skip bombing. So they're going to come in incredibly low, and they're going to drop their bombs just short of the ship, and like a stone skipping on the water, these bombs are going to land in the water and skip across the water and hit the side of Japanese ships. They also will get so close that some of the bombs will come out of the bomb bay and go directly into the side of the ship. But you can see in this picture how incredibly low level that is. Well, to take a plane in that low level into the face of anti-aircraft fire, that's a problem. So how are we going to stop that problem? We're going to have something called suppression of enemy air defense, or SEAD. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to use aircraft to knock out anti-aircraft positions on ships so then these bombers can get in. One of the most effective at this time is the Australian Air Force's Viewfighter. The Viewfighter has a forward firing capability of 4 20-millimeter cannons and 6 rifle caliber machine guns per plane, all firing forward. That's a lot of firepower. Well, the Japanese, they make a mistake as well. So what they're going to do is they're going to take these soldiers that are in these ships and put them up on deck and have them use their rifles and their machine guns to try to boost their anti-aircraft fire. This doesn't work out well for them, to put it bluntly. So now these things are coming in with all this firepower and they're massacring these Japanese soldiers on deck. And if you'd want to see an aircraft of this type, we build aircraft similar. We come to the same idea as what's going on with these Viewfighters. Is if you go to the USS Alabama park in Mobile, there's a B-25J there that is armed with 10 forward firing 50 caliber machine guns. So you can see that we decided to adopt this as well for our aircraft. So again, this is going to have a tremendous amount of firepower that will suppress enemy air defense, and then we can bring our planes in super low, and they are going to do a hell of a job. How good a job do? They sink the 7 remaining transports and 4 of the destroyers. So the Japanese force is completely destroyed. So of that 6,900 troops, only 1,200 will ever make it to Leh, and of course they have no equipment. And of course, their units are completely disorganized. Another 2,700 are rescued by the 4 remaining destroyers and some Japanese submarines that actually have to come in and try to pick these guys up. They're taken back to Rabaul. So the Japanese lose 2,890 soldiers and sailors in this one event. We lose virtually nothing. Well, what does this show us? This shows us that the Japanese are completely unable to resupply their troops in the face of air power. Air power is decisive in New Guinea, and as we continue to move up the coast, we will continue to build more and more air bases. So even without dive bombers, we find a way to make the Japanese have an inability to support their troops. Well, now in September, the Australians are going to attempt to take Leh, and you can see the big red box there. That's where they're going to land. They also have troops coming up from the town of Salamaua, which they have captured, and people from Wau, which are on the inland. And this is going to be an entire division landing by the Australians. And they're also going to have an airborne regiment make a drop on the 5th at a town called Nedzab. I'll probably mispronounce that, just so you know. But so they're going to do everything they can to get the Japanese further and further away from Australia. Well, the Australians face stiff resistance but eventually the Japanese are going to be forced to withdraw. And because they're going to be surrounded. And they just see it. If you see that line going towards the top of the map, that is the Japanese withdrawal plan. Well, where are the Japanese withdrawn to? They've withdrawn into a triple canopy rainforest. So now they're not supplied. They have no medication. Basically, they can't get anything in there. And they're going to have to march 140 miles through the jungle to get to Madang. This will be how we, particularly the Australians and the New Zealanders, will fight this battle throughout World War II. They will continually push the Japanese further and further up the coast, building air bases, and basically letting them starve to death and die of disease on this island. Far more Japanese die on New Guinea because of starvation and disease than they ever do because of being killed by shell fire, for example. So the combined forces of the Australians now begins to get rather large. We see that they have got 4 first-class divisions. There's an entire New Zealand division, and these people will continue to pursue the Japanese up this coast throughout this time. So what that does is that frees a lot of forces for us to be used in the Central Pacific. So by the Australians defending basically this area and attacking in this area, that leaves us with more and more troops for us to attack in the Central Pacific and the Solomons. Well, the success of Operation Cartwheel leads actually not to the capture of Rabaul, but to the isolation of Rabaul. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But so we are going to continue to get closer and closer to that southern resource area. And the Australians will fight on these in this area up until 1945. So they are always continually fighting in New Guinea. Well, the Japanese army has well, I wouldn't say a saying, but a thought process. When they're going to be transferred, perhaps from China or Manchuria into the Southern Pacific area, they make this statement that if you're transferred to Java, you're in heaven because it's really good duty there. It's plenty to eat. It's like a big party. If you're transferred to the Philippines, you're in hell because you're going to be fighting the Philippine guerrillas. And if you're transferred to New Guinea, no one ever comes back from New Guinea. So the Japanese are well aware of what's going on here. Well, let's talk about the isolation of Japanese bases, or what we refer to as island hopping. And island hopping is going to be incredibly effective. So by the use of our air power, by the use of capturing islands and surrounding these things with air power and naval power, what we're capable of doing is creating basically prisoner of war camps. So if we look at this map, you can see Rabaul is the lower red circle and Truk Atoll is the upper red circle. I just use these two as because they're perhaps the largest. So for example, by isolating Rabaul, we have 90,000 Japanese soldiers on Rabaul. They can't go anywhere, they can't do anything, and they can't be resupplied. Like I talked about, they actually begin to use their submarines to resupply these bases because they can't get anything in there. So basically what we've created is this really large prisoner of war camps. So two most prominent being Truk and Rabaul. There's 90,000 Japanese at Rabaul. They're literally starving to death. So they all start to farm in order to survive. So it's a great idea. And we will do this at numerous other islands as well. And my personal opinion is we should have done this far more. There are many islands that we should never have attacked. And we'll talk about that as this class goes on. But this is a tremendous advantage that we gain with our naval power and our air power that the Japanese don't have this capability. Well, now the spring of 44, we continue to move forward, and we now are going to be looking at the Marianas Islands, which is that big red circle there. And we're just going to continue to march across the Central Pacific. We've got MacArthur in the south, moving up New Guinea. And the next objective is going to be that Marianas Islands. And basically the idea is always to provide air cover as we move further and further towards the island of Japan. Again, warplay in orange. Well, we're going to have a fifth fleet now is going to be the covering force for this. And this is June of 1944. So we talked about the size of our fleet when we attacked Basio at Tarawa Atoll. Now this fleet consists of 535 ships. They've got 71,000 troops that are going to invade Saipan. And that's out of a total force on board of military capability of 100,000 troops. That's a mighty big force. Okay. Spring of 44. Well, this is strongly driven. Now, there's lots of thoughts about where we should go with our forces. And at this particular time, the decision is made with the strong support of the Army Air Force. And the reason that is Hap Arnold wants to deploy the new B-29 bombers, which have incredibly long range and have incredible strategic power, the Air Force believes. And so if they can get this island, they're within 1,300 miles of the main production centers of Japan, and they can begin an aerial bombardment, strategic air power, to destroy the Japanese ability to wage war. And certainly they believe the super fortress is a war-winning weapon, that this capability that this aircraft has, nobody else in the world has, not to mention we're going to build a lot of them. And we're going to spend $3 billion to do that. So there's a lot of effort going into building this aircraft. Well, the Army Air Force intends to demonstrate thoroughly that they are a war-winning capability, that they need to be a separate force. So in other words, they're not, right now, they're part of the Army Air Force. They desperately want to become a separate force. They want to have independence from the Army. So they want to be viewed as the Army, Navy, Air Force, as we see that somewhat today. So that's a big goal. They're going to prove the effectiveness of strategic bombardment by capturing the Marianas. As you may remember, I talked about the fact that the initial deployment of the B-29 is actually in China. And in order to use those aircraft, they have to fly all their supplies over the Himalayan mountains, or commonly known as the hump. And the only targets that they can make from that far away is to hit the southernmost Japanese island of Kyushu. So this will be a huge, huge advantage for the Army Air Force. Well, there's three main islands they want to capture. They want to capture Saipan, they want to capture Tinian, and Guam. And Guam was actually a former U.S. possession. And they can feel that with these three islands, they can stage 1,000 bombers on these islands. And by staging 1,000 bombers, they can be resupplied by sea, unlike flying stuff over the Himalayas. Indeed, they can all be used with ships. So this will be a much, much more logistically feasible thing to be doing by capturing the Marianas. So there's a lot of reasons we want to capture the Marianas, particularly, as it turns out, in World War II, this reason. Well, the Japanese view this as a direct threat to the home islands. They've heard about the B-29. It's actually been mentioned in the U.S. press that we have this new bomber coming out, and it's going to have incredibly long range, and it has all these incredible capabilities. And the Japanese are going to have what I will refer to as a violent reaction to our ability to capture the Mariana Islands. It's going to be something that's the last thing they want us to do, is to capture that, because they regard the Marianas as part of their inner defense zone. So this is the last zone they really want us to be fighting in. Remember, they always expected that the war would be over by now. And if we catch the Marianas, that we are putting, again, their shipping at risk, and of course the B-29 attacking the homeland. And the Marianas have actually been part of Japan since the end of World War I. Marianas were a German possession, and the World War I, the Japanese fought on the side of the Allies. At the Treaty of Versailles, they are given German possessions. And one of the possessions they are given at the Treaty of Versailles is indeed the Marianas Islands. So there's actually 25,000 Japanese civilians that have moved to this island in order to primarily grow sugar, I believe. But regardless, for numerous reasons, there's a lot of Japanese population on this island. And so this will be the first time in World War II that a Japanese population is actually in harm's way. And that will have significant results for what goes on this island. Well, again, I said this is the inner defense zone. The Japanese have not really put much effort into defending these areas because, quite honestly, they expected that they would stop us at perhaps the Gilberts and the war would be over by now. And so they didn't put a lot of effort into defending this inner zone. Well, as I talked about last week with submarines, indeed, now they're going to start taking troops in that Kwantung army in Manchukuo, or as we know it, Manchuria, and they're going to begin to put those people on board ships and bring them out to these islands. Well, our submarines are going to make a mess out of that for them, and we begin to sink many of these ships. So they can never really get what they want to do on these islands, particularly Saipan. And they do manage to get some of these troops that are sunk are rescued and brought ashore. But of course, when they're brought ashore, they don't have any of their heavy equipment. There's no tanks. There's no artillery. The units themselves are disorganized because not everybody is rescued. So they're going to be much, much less effective because of our submarine power. And what's going to happen then, of course, is they're going to manage to realize that they get 30,000 troops on this island. But again, these troops are much, much less combat effective than they would have been had they been landed without the intervention of our submarines. Yes, Bill.
Said that Japanese thought the war would be over by this time. Did they envision some kind of truce? What were they thinking?
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit more. The question is why did the Japanese envision the war being over by 1944? The Japanese realized, and we'll talk about this, that U.S. naval capability and U.S. military ramp up would be so aggressive and so much more than they could possibly build, that they realized that after 3 years of war, and we talked about this actually in the first class, second class perhaps, but they realized that they could never outbuild us. And so because they couldn't outbuild us, the U.S. Navy after 3 years would be so powerful that if they didn't end the war by that time, they had virtually no chance to win the war. And the Japanese knew that up front going in before Pearl Harbor. So that was always their plan, that the Germans would beat the Russians, the Germans would beat the British. We would be so tied up worrying about Germany that we would acquiesce to their hegemony of Southeast Asia. Of course, it doesn't work out that way for them, but that's the premise. Okay, so that's why they always thought that. Yes, sir.
Since this knowledge was there to begin with, wasn't there some part of Japan that was willing to sue for peace after 3 years, since they knew for a fact they were going to lose?
That is a very, very good question. Why wasn't there more of a peace faction in Japan that knew they couldn't win and then sue for peace? There's a lot of reasons for that. I would say probably the biggest single reason is the cowardice and the lack of moral fiber by the Japanese military leadership. That they were actually afraid to, for many reasons, to basically admit that the war was over. They were literally willing to continue to fight after we dropped the atomic bomb on them. They didn't want to surrender at all. Okay, so it's totally against Japanese nature. Remember the cult of death. It's totally against their nature to wish to no matter how logical it seems to us, to sue for peace, actually never to get in the war in the first place. But that has never been their thought process. So you always have this issue. Yes, there were a lot of Japanese that wanted the war to end, but they were afraid to do so. Put it that way. Well, got 30,000 defenders on Saipan. And the U.S. fleet arrives on the 13th, and they're going to begin a bombardment. That bombardment will go on for 3 days, not 3 hours. We will have numerous aircraft carriers. You can see the red circle. That is where basically we are going to land on Saipan. And we land on the 15th, 300 Amtraks, put 8,000 Marines on by 9 in the morning. So you can see that our capability to land forces has taken, in just 7 months, an exponential leap. We are able to do this much landing. It's so quick with much better equipment. It's really incredible, I think. And the Japanese, of course, are going to launch this nighttime attack on our forces. Of course, they're not as organized as they should be because of the submarine losses. And the Navy is going to be right offshore, and they're going to blast these guys. And the night assault is wrecked by the fact that we begin to use illumination shells, or people call them star shells, to light up the area. And they fire virtually their whole supply of this type of ammunition that first day to destroy this Japanese counterattack. So again, the Japanese see that these types of counterattacks are not going to be effective, and that's going to play into a big role in future classes as we talk about assaults like Peleliu. Yes, Bill?
All the troops put ashore and right, no Higgins boats.
Some were Higgins. Yeah, but the initial force was primarily Amtraks. Well, first day fighting, the Marines are really ashore well. There's no, things are going pretty well for them. They think there's only 15,000 Japanese on the island. Of course, there are actually 30,000 Japanese on this island. So that's a major, major problem for them. But the Japanese really are now in a very tough situation because of the fact that we put this much force onto this island. We have these capabilities. Yes, Alan?
The Japanese codes at this point?
No, they never figure that out. The Japanese never figure out that we've broken their codes. Just so we know. And we will, by the end of World War II, we are actually reading their diplomatic codes as fast as they are. We have thousands of people working on breaking Japanese codes by the end of the war. It's amazing capability, which I talked about significantly in my atomic bomb class. But so anyway, so now we've got this huge invasion going on. Things are going pretty well so far. And where did this capability come from? And it comes from a thing called the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1940. So the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1940 is incredibly important to the development of the United States Navy and our capabilities in World War II. And it's done by a gentleman named Carl Vinson. He's a congressman from Georgia. And Carl Vinson makes the decision that he needs to get, we need a much bigger Navy. Why do we need a bigger Navy? Well, simply, we've got to defend the Pacific. We've got to defend the Atlantic. And so we've got a need for two ocean Navy. And the Japanese are well aware of this situation too. This will tie into what Bill had asked. So simply this, the Japanese know going into the war in 1941 that this will be the absolute peak strength that they will have at this time is in relationship to the U.S. fleet. Because the way it was in 1922, there's the Washington Naval Conference. In 1930, there's the London Naval Conference. And the nations of the world at that time agreed to certain fleet limits, particularly in major capital ships. So 5 is the number for the U.S., 5 is the number for the British, and 3 is the number for the Japanese. So we get a 5 total of ships. British get a 5 total ships. Japanese get 3. And the reason is that we have to defend the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the British have worldwide, colonies. And so the Japanese really don't have any choice but to agree to this. But actually, many people in Japan, the naval leadership, realizes this is the best they could get anyway. They could never match us in a building war in the 20s and 30s. So the Japanese know that in December of 41, their fleet, because they've abrogated this treaty, will be at 78% of our fleet. If we have to defend the Atlantic and the Pacific, then indeed we can't put all of our forces into the Pacific. And this is their opportunity to make their land grab of the southeast southern resource area, and of course get hegemony in Asia. The goal, of course, is that we will eventually, basically, because of our isolationist movement, acquiesce to their ability to maintain, and we won't fight for places in quotes that we've never even heard of. So this is a huge advantage, because in 1940, remember, France has fallen. And the United States is extremely worried, particularly about the Germans and the Japanese. And so they passed this bill 316-0. Yes.
The 316-0 is really amazing, considering the strength of the isolation movement at this time.
Yes, it is.
I look at it as, hey, these are our oceans, we've got to protect it, and that prevents everybody else from bothering us.
Precisely. The isolation movement would jump on board because they want to make sure that no one comes to bother us.
Right, and so it actually united both factions.
Right. Absolutely.
It's still amazing. It was 316-0.
316-0. The draft only passes by 1 vote.
I know.
So anyway, big issue there. So, but anyway, $8.55 billion in 1940 money. That's really, really big dough. Okay. And we've already been building a little bit, but you can see that what's really amazing to me about this is 1940 is that they've seen the power of naval aviation. So when you look at this bill, the biggest thing we're going to build is aircraft carriers. This bill allows us to build 18 aircraft carriers. It only allows us to build 7 battleships. So even by 1940, we always think about battleships being the queen of the sea, and the old hardshell Navy was into the battleship thing. They've seen the fact that the writing is on the wall with aircraft carriers. Yes.
the treaty that limited the number of ships,
Yes,
it limited battleships, did it affect aircraft?
yes. Aircraft carriers were affected, the Washington Naval Agreement and the London Agreement in 1930, the London Agreement actually expands it. So, aircraft carriers were allowed for in Washington by a certain number. I can't remember the tonnage exactly, but it's a pretty good amount. And of course, we get basically a third more than the Japanese are going to get, right? So we can build, and we'll talk about that when we talk about these carriers here. But just quickly, the 1930 agreement now expands that to submarines, cruisers, etc. So in 1930, the agreement is expanded greatly, not just to capital ships, but to other classes of ships as well. So hopefully that answers that. Well, as I was saying, not only does it allow for 18 aircraft carriers, but it allows for the Navy to buy 15,000 aircraft. That's a huge, huge advantage that from where they were at. And Carl Vinson says this, he says, the modern development of aircraft has demonstrated conclusively that the backbone of the Navy today is the aircraft carrier. This is in 1940, well before Pearl Harbor, well before we really see this. So when people talk about, you know, that we were very battleship centric until after Pearl Harbor, that's not necessarily true. It was realized that aircraft carriers were going to be vitally important. Well, what do we build by May of 44? We built 10 Essex class carriers. Those are fleet carriers. We built 9 Independence class. Those are light carriers. We have numerous escort carriers. Escort carriers are built out of merchant ship hulls. So they're not fast. They're basically slow, but they're useful for a lot of ways, particularly anti-submarine warfare is what they're most commonly known for. And we build a lot of carriers. So what has the Japanese been able to build by this time? Because remember, this was the year of gathering strength, 43. They managed to build 1 fleet carrier, and they convert 4 ocean liners to carriers. These are not particularly effective ships to be used as aircraft carriers. And they convert 2 mine layers and 2, which are about 11,000 tons each. And they convert 2 seaplane tenders that are about 13,000 tons each. That's the best the Japanese can do in this time frame. Yes, Alan.
This slide, would you please show which is which?
I was intend to do that next. Okay, so what are these aircraft carriers? The first one, the lower part of the picture, is the USS Saratoga. The USS Saratoga was a pre-war design. It is our first fleet carriers. There were 2 of those built, the other one being the Lexington, which is lost at the Battle of Coral Sea. They're really big and they're really fast, but they don't handle their aircraft particularly well because they only have 2 elevators. They were built to be battle cruisers, part of the Washington Naval Agreement. The next aircraft carrier to it is the USS Enterprise. That is a Yorktown class carrier. Incredibly effective design, as we've talked about. There were 3 of those. The Hornet and the Yorktown are both lost in 1942. Again, it's very fast. It carries approximately 70 aircraft and it has 3 elevators. So it's a very, very effective design and can take a lot of punishment, as we've seen, particularly the Hornet. Well, the next carrier there is the new Essex class carrier. And the Essex class carrier there is actually the new USS Hornet. So we've renamed it after a carrier that was lost. And this is a 27,000 ton ship. It's an improvement on the Yorktown class. And it carries 80 aircraft. It's also fast and it's also very survivable. None of these are lost in World War II. Many of them are terribly damaged, but none are sunk. And I would say that the Essex class is the first class of carriers that we have that is superior to the Japanese Shokaku and Zuyukaku. And I think up until this time, those are the 2 best aircraft carriers in the world the Japanese had. This aircraft carrier is at least equivalent and probably superior. And then the little bitty aircraft carrier up there, that's an Independence class aircraft carrier. Well, what is the purpose of that? Well, after Pearl Harbor, even though we were building all these carriers under the Naval Act, indeed, we decided we needed more carriers. So there were a bunch of cruisers being constructed, and we took 9 of those cruiser hulls and converted them to aircraft carriers. So since they are conversions, they got a couple of advantages. They're converted from a warship, not a ocean liner, not a good plan. And so they're fast. Now they're not real big, they're only 11,000 tons. But they've got an advantage that we can use is that they can keep up with the fleet carriers. And they don't carry a large complement of aircraft. They only carry 24 fighters and 12 TBF Avengers or TBD Avengers, depending on the model. And so what are they used for? They supply combat air patrol over the fleet carriers with all those fighters, and those torpedo bombers are used for anti-submarine war protection as well for our fleet carriers. That fleet frees up our fleet carriers in order to do their job of attacking the enemy and maintaining control of the seas. So these are incredibly useful little ships, and they will fight throughout the entire war. Some are actually lost. Yes, Jim.
Why is the tower, I forgot what you call it, always on the starboard side?
Well, that's a U.S. thing. They've decided that that's the best place to put it. Why is the island is what it's called. The island always on the starboard or the right side of our carriers. We decide that's the best way to do it. Several Japanese carriers actually have it on the left side.
Well, they lost the war.
Yeah, well, I know that, but that's not the reason. Okay. So anyway, it's basically they decide that's the best way for the wind to be dealt with. Okay, that's the best way to put it. But indeed, there are other carriers that have it on the port side. Well, another thing we develop is called the underway replenishment at sea. Okay, so after World War I, the United States does major studies about trying to see what goes on with ships when they're at sea for a long amount of time. And they realize that for every 1,000 miles you get away from your main port, you lose 10% of your combat effectiveness. And we have to think about the fact that in the Pacific, we don't really have a lot of bases. We have Pearl Harbor and we have Manila. And then, of course, early in 42, we lose Manila. So we really only have one big base in the Pacific at this time. And that's a problem because you need to keep ships at sea fighting. So the U.S. is going to develop a thing called the Fleet Supply Train. And so when we look at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had 77 support ships. By December of 1942, he has 358 support ships. And we've talked about building the U.S. Liberty ships. We build 2,500 of those. So we have the capability to keep our ships at sea much, much longer than any other nation in the world. And simply this is we can bring them every conceivable thing they need. They can give them fuel. We can give them ammunition. We can bring food in. We can bring the sailors movies. We can bring the sailors mail, okay, which is really important for morale. And so we can keep our ships at sea for incredibly long amounts of time. I mean, literally months at a time, our ships can stay at sea. And those little escort carriers, well, they got another thing they can do too. Those little merchant ship carriers, they can resupply aircraft to replace losses on our fleet ships. So as the fleet ships take losses, they can fly in new planes and new pilots to continually keep our forces up to full strength. Incredible amount of capability that we developed. When we look at the Japanese could indeed refuel at sea, but they never had the capability to do what we can do. So when we looked at Kido Butai strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor, indeed, they could raid those 6 carriers, but those 6 carriers could not be sustained at sea for an incredibly long amount of time. So that is going to also increase our capability to isolate these islands and to destroy Japanese forces, particularly without having to invade these islands. Well, a couple other things that's going to make the U.S. fleet virtually invulnerable to Japanese counterattack and use of conventional weapons. So in other words, Japanese dropping bombs or dropping torpedoes. A couple of things are simply this. We're going to take some older technologies and refine them. And we're going to take some completely new technologies and use those as well. The first one will, of course, be radar. And radar simply has been around, but our early radars were not able to detect altitude. So what we would do is we would stack fighter groups at 3 levels, low, medium, high, in order to intercept a Japanese force. Not a particularly effective way to use your forces. Well, because radar is improved, we now can read altitude, and indeed we can destroy those forces by sending masses of aircraft at them. Another thing, big improvement, is the Combat Information Center. We now centralize our command and control on ships to control aircraft in the air, and that capability is much, much greater than it was early in the war. So now it's very difficult for the Japanese to get near our ships without being intercepted. And then I think perhaps one of the most innovative pieces of World War II is this thing, is the proximity fuse. When we look at firing anti-aircraft cannon, not machine guns, but cannon at high altitude Japanese or whoever's aircraft, they're coming in. We don't exactly know how high they are. We don't exactly know how fast they are. I've got to take a mechanical fuse and set it for a certain amount of time. I fire that shell in the air, and hopefully I've guessed all those things correctly, and it blows up in the midst of those aircraft. Proximity fuse changes that completely, because what we were able to build, and again with 1940s technology, is a fuse that actually has a miniature radar in it. Now think about the fact that there are no microprocessors. There's not even transistors. These things are tubes. Okay, so now I'm going to fire a tube. Now, if you remember tube televisions or tube radios or whatever, you know those things are kind of fragile, right? We developed one that can be fired out of a cannon with those tremendous G forces. It's spinning 5,000 RPM a minute or faster. And indeed, this thing then senses a Japanese aircraft or whoever, German, and blows up when it gets close to it. So it takes all those problems out. Yes.
Who developed that?
The United States and the British jointly.
I mean, specifically.
The particular person, I don't remember.
No, I mean, Auburn or Harvard or MIT.
It was probably, again, I'll send you a link.
Okay, thank you.
I have a video on it, so.
Another thing that might be after a while, the radar be tracking with aircraft, so we would know what altitude we were.
Oh, right, exactly. We didn't know exactly because our radar improved.
The gun mounts were equipped based on the latest equipment to set the time when there's time. So they were.
Right. There was definitely radar control of gun turrets later in the war, but I still think the proximity fuse was a much bigger advantage than even doing that. So anyway, the first time that this fuse is actually used is in the Pacific by the USS Helena in, I believe, January of 1943. And it shoots down 2 Japanese dive bombers, Vals. So again, a tremendous amount. So now the U.S. fleet's virtually invulnerable. Well, what's going on? We talked a little bit about this last week. I'll make this brief. Is we have developed new aircraft. When we start the war, the Japanese Zero is the best fighter in the Pacific. Not by a tremendous amount. That's tended to be overrated. But indeed, it was superior in climb. It was superior in speed, slightly over the Wildcat. And we come up with new aircraft. And the new aircraft, instead of being powered by a 1,200 horsepower engine like the Wildcat, it's got this 2,000 horsepower engine, which I personally think is one of the greatest engines in World War II. It's used on this aircraft. It's used on the Corsair. It's used on the P-47 Thunderbolt. It's used on the P-61 Black Widow, yada, yada, yada. And I think it's at least as good or better than the Rolls-Royce Merlin as far as a war-winning weapon. And we build this aircraft, and it's faster than a Zero. At high altitude, it's as maneuverable as a Zero. It can outclimb a Zero because a Zero has much less horsepower. starts the war with only 960. This is basically double that compared to an older Model 0. And this is a completely very docile aircraft. It's very, very easy to land this aircraft on an aircraft carrier. The Corsair, not so much. So that's why the Navy basically adopts this aircraft for its aircraft carriers primarily. The Corsair will be used later in the war. The British actually come up with a way to land it more safely. But this aircraft, 305 of its pilots become aces. And it's credited with shooting down approximately 5,000 enemy aircraft. An incredibly advantage over what we had earlier in the war. Well, let's talk a little bit about Japan. Well, Japan, what they decide to do is they're going at the beginning of the war, they've got the Zero, they got excellent aircraft, and they've got incredibly highly trained pilots. Now, that can be argued a little bit at Pearl Harbor that indeed the pilots on the Shokaku and Zuyakaku were not up to the standards of the other pilots, but still their overall training of Japanese naval pilots is very incredible. And when we look at this gentleman here, Saburo Sakai, who's perhaps the most famous Japanese ace because he survived the war and wrote a book, he is going to be, he's an enlisted sailor, all right? He's just a sailor on a ship. And they got this program where if you can apply and you've been a good sailor, you could perhaps become a pilot. And indeed, he applies. 5,000 people apply. 75 people are accepted and 25 graduate. That's pretty damn selective. Okay. And Japanese have other methods to recruit pilots too, but they're all basically to this level of incredible amount of training. And if you read his book, Samurai, you'll know more what I'm talking about. It's pretty ugly what they make these guys do. But anyway, so what happened is, of course, they're fighting in the Solomons, as we've talked about. They got to fly 600 miles from Rabaul to get to Guadalcanal, and they got to fly 600 miles back. And the Japanese don't have a lot of replacement pilots. Now, these people aren't getting proper food. They're not getting proper medication. They're continually fighting over and over and over again. Our aircraft on Guadalcanal are generally there for about 8 to 10 weeks. And then we withdraw that unit, the survivors, and the survivors then will go on perhaps to train new pilots or will perhaps find their way back to the war later on, but they're not under constant pressure to stay in battle week after week, month after month. Well, this whittles down this Japanese force terribly. Remember, I've talked about 4 key aces from this 11th Air Fleet. Well, Lieutenant Sasai, 27 kills. He's shot down over Guadalcanal, literally crashes on Henderson Field. Sakai's good friend Ota, 34 kills. He is shot down over Guadalcanal. Sasai himself Sakai takes a bullet wound to the head, attacking U.S. aircraft, and manages to fly back all the way to Rabaul with this head wound and loses an eye. He becomes a trainer for a while, but then they're so pressed for pilots by 44, they send him back to the front, even though he only has one eye. Something the U.S. would never do. Well, Nishizawa, their perhaps top ace of World War II, he survives Guadalcanal and the Solomons, but he's killed over the Philippines. So when we look at from April of 42 to April of 43, the Japanese Navy alone loses 2,816 aircraft and all those irreplaceable air crew. That's a major problem for them because they don't have a pipeline of pilots that we do. And the reason is simply that they start out the war with 700 hours average for their pilots, which is really a lot. And that by 1945 is going to drop to 275 hours. So that's a precipitous drop in training. It actually gets worse than this. So by 1944, late in the year, a Japanese Navy pilot is graduating with 40 hours of flight time. That's a joke, okay? You barely know what you're doing. Our pilots are graduating with 525 hours of flight time. So these guys are terribly outclassed. And the 1920s, the US kind of had the same idea that we would make a small group of superb naval pilots. But by the mid to late 30s, we decide, maybe we need a lot more pilots. And they decide, indeed, that they're going to rather have, instead of this incredibly small group of superb pilots, they're going to have a large group of good pilots. And that's something the Japanese really don't come to until 1942. So we're years ahead of them. So when we look at pilot training, we train 193,000 pilots during World War II. The Japanese trained 46,000, but many of those pilots are at the end of the war and have got virtually no training. So that really inflates their numbers. So we can see that, again, the Japanese are really at a difficult position. Well, let's talk a little about their naval response. Yes.
We'll get to that slide. 193,000 US pilots includes those trained for European.
Yes, it's total pilots, not just Navy pilots. That'd be a lot of Navy pilots. Yes, Ellen.
Do I remember you're saying that the Japanese and the Germans had no policy that you flew a certain number of missions and then you rotated out?
The Germans had a similar problem that they couldn't rotate as much as we could. They still did pull people back much more than the Japanese, but again, they were very short of pilots as well. Yes.
But the percentage of adult male population in Japan versus the US, did they just not have as many eligible people?
They don't have as many eligible people. Their population, they always say it was 100 million. It was probably more like 60 or 70 million. So we did have a larger population. I think ours at that time might have been, don't quote me, but I would say over 100 million. Probably 130 million. You'd have to look that up. But indeed, our population was larger. But I don't think that's really the issue. Again, you're talking about a small percentage of highly qualified people. So quite honestly, my opinion would be that indeed they could have made a lot more pilots than they did. Obviously, look at Sakai. They had 5,000 volunteers, except 75 and only graduate 25. So they could have graduated a lot more than that, in my opinion. But anyway, Japanese carriers, a lot of problems. They build one fleet carrier. The rest of these carriers are not carriers. They're ocean liners. You can see one here, the Taiho or the Junyo. It's not made to be an aircraft carrier. So they're going to be vastly less effective than our aircraft carriers are going to be that are purpose built. Let's make that simple. So that's the best they can do, though, with the capabilities they have. And of course, they have problems with getting air crews. So in order to fight at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they are going to begin to take trainers from their training facilities and put them on ships. So really, for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which is the naval reaction to our invasion of the Marianas, let's make that clear, is indeed they can only get about 450 aircraft on their carriers. But they're going to have to do something now that they've been planning all along, which I've talked about several times at least, is the fact that they're going to have a decisive naval battle. And this is the best they can do after building strength in the year of 43. And that battle is always known to the Japanese as Kantai Kessen, which is their big fleet battle that they will win and win World War II. Remember, they're running out of time. Okay? And so that's always been their strategy since the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. So there's always been, but now it's going to not be battleships, it's going to be with carriers. But unfortunately, their carriers are pretty much inferior to ours. Well, the Japanese have this plan. They call it Ago. And the idea of Ago is they're going to have this major fight. They're going to destroy the U.S. fleet, and that will cause them to basically, hopefully, get us to admit to a negotiated peace in the Pacific. And they think we're going to invade the Caroline Islands. We do not. Of course, we invade the Marianas. And that doesn't change their idea. They're still going to have Ago. Well, they know that we have about 15 carriers available and about 900 aircraft. Now, remember, their carriers only have about 450. But they're going to have a different plan. Much like what we did with Midway, is they're going to use the island of Guam as an air base. There will be 300 Japanese aircraft on Guam and 450 at sea. And they've got another couple of major advantages. Japanese aircraft have a longer range than ours do. So simply stated that they can launch from further away than we can retaliate. Another big advantage is there's trade winds in this area. So they're sailing into the winds. The wind's blowing east to west. They're sailing into the wind, they can launch. The US, in order to launch, has to turn around and go into the wind in order to launch our aircraft, sailing away from the Japanese. The Japanese realize that anytime they want, they can disengage. So they have the ability to engage or disengage at will, something we don't. Pretty good plan, really, on paper. This way I could put that. The Japanese are going to do another thing. They're going to keep their carriers so far out of range that they're going to use shuttle tactics. They're going to launch their carrier aircraft. They're going to strike the U.S. fleet. They're going to land on Guam, refuel, rearm, strike our fleet again, and then go back to their carriers. Pretty good plan. Doesn't work. And you can see this guy holding up his fingers. He shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers. And they spot the Japanese carriers with submarines again. Submarines will then radio the information. Admiral Mitcher, who's in charge of our carriers, he definitely wants to go charging after the Japanese with everything he's got. Admiral Spruance says, no, you have to stay and defend the landing. And that's per Nimitz orders. There's a huge argument about this post-war, that this was an opportunity we had to destroy the whole Japanese fleet, yada, yada. But I tend to agree with Spruance. His job was to protect that landing, and indeed, that's what he does. Well, the morning of the 19th, the Japanese launched their all-out assault on our carriers and our battle fleet. And we, of course, have the Hellcats. We've got combat information centers. We've got proximity fuses. We have all these advantages, and we shoot down in one day 346 Japanese aircraft. We lose 23 aircraft to do that. This will forever be known not as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. So, quite honestly, the Japanese air power in one day is virtually destroyed. What do they achieve with that? They land one bomb on the South Dakota battleship, and they near miss several carriers and score no torpedo hits. To lose that many aircraft, it's a disaster, to put it bluntly. Things are getting worse. Because remember, I told you that the Japanese are being stalked by our submarines. The Albacore is going to launch a spread at the brand new fleet carrier Taiho. The Taiho is going to be hit by one torpedo. It's a new ship. The damage control is not up to snuff. The Japanese always incorporate their aviation fuel tanks into the hull. This is not particularly a good plan because the shock wave of that torpedo ruptures 2 of these tanks. The carrier begins to fill with fumes. The damage control people make the terrible decision and begin to use fans to vent this gasoline fumes. Well, of course, that now drives gasoline fumes throughout the entire aircraft carrier. The generator sparks and the Taiho blows up. Yes.
What is the normal fuel for ocean-going vessels? Bunker sea oil or?
Yeah, bunker sea oil. But the Japanese have another problem with that, which we will talk about at the battle off of Samar, but because they're using fuel directly from the ground, which is vastly more volatile.
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, this thing blows up. Well, didn't fight very much. One battle, one launch of aircraft gone. The USS Kavala fires a spread of 6 torpedoes at our good friend from Pearl Harbor, the Shokaku, and hits 3 hits. Again, the tanks rupture and the Shokaku blows up and sinks quickly. Things are going poorly. Well, Admiral Ozawa, who's on the flagship, which is the Taiho, has to get off the ship, and he is on a destroyer. He doesn't know what's going on. He's not really in communications. So he makes the assumption that the bulk of their aircraft are landed on Guam and are going to come back. That's not going to happen. So he decides to keep the bulk of their carrier force near the Marianas. So they really, at this point, they should have run like hell. But he doesn't know that. He's under the assumption that they're going to have another attack and the planes are going to come back. Now, well, they're going to stay in that area and they're going to be vulnerable to counterattack, of course. And Mitscher is going to now be given permission from Spruance after the disaster on the 19th. On the 20th, he's allowed to go after the Japanese carriers. The U.S. fleet sails as quickly as they can. And finally, by midday on the 20th, they manage to find the Japanese fleet. He launches a strike at the extreme range, also knowing that our aircraft will be landing at night. This is a major problem. They're not trained to do that. What he will do, though, is he'll try to lessen that situation. Well, Avenger scores one torpedo hit on one of those aircraft carriers that are converted from a ocean liner, and of course it ruptures its fuel tank, and what does it do? It blows up. So the Japanese lose another one, but there's a problem now. We've got these planes at extreme range, they're running out of fuel, and Mitscher decides to turn all the lights on our fleet in order to help these guys find their way back. Very dangerous if there's Japanese submarines around, which there were not. But still, that's a huge risk he takes. But we lose 100 aircraft because they run out of fuel. Most of those pilots, fortunately, survive. They're picked up by destroyers, most of them. They can see the fleet, they land close to the fleet, and then get picked up. So most of these people are rescued. So the results are simply this from this battle. The Japanese are going to lose 3 aircraft carriers. 2 of those 3 are fleet carriers. They only had 3 fleet carriers, so they got 1 left. They lose 550 aircraft. The cream that they've been able to build up of naval air power is destroyed in 2 days. And from now on, they know that they can never attack us with conventional forces. They have to attack us using what I will refer to as Tokotai, which is special attack, which we is normally referred to as kamikaze. That's the only way they think at this point they can fight the U.S. fleet. And they're pretty accurate. Well, the next piece I want to talk about is because of Mr. St. John here, he has brought this question up, and I decided at that point we would talk a bit about it. And this is the famous Smith versus Smith issue. And remember, I talked about at Macon Island, the 27th Infantry Division was held in less than, let's face it, Holland Smith doesn't like them. He doesn't like their general, Ralph C. Smith. And this creates a thing called the Smith versus Smith controversy. It goes back to Macon Island. So what has happened at Saipan is this. There's 2 Marine divisions that landed on the first day, and on the second day, we land the 27th Infantry Division. They are driving northward. The Marines have a division on the north shore on the beach, on the east shore on the beach, and on the west shore on the beach. The Army unit is driving up the center of the island, which is mountainous. The Marines, of course, have easier terrain, and they're making much further advances, and they continuously have to hold up to wait for the Army unit to catch up. Well, Holland Smith, is furious. So once again, the Army is letting him down. They're taking too long. They're not doing what they're supposed to do, and he's fed up. And he goes to Turner, who's in command of the invasion transports, and then goes to Spruance and says, I need this guy out of here. I need a new general. This guy isn't fighting. This unit's not fighting the way it should be. He's got to go. And so basically, Spruance and Turner say, okay, you're making the decision. Go ahead, fire the guy. That's a huge issue because he's firing an Army general.
Doesn't the Army general outrank him?
No.
A lieutenant general is higher than a major.
Yes. Yes, he's higher. He's the corps commander versus a division commander. Okay. So he fires him. And he fires him really kind of brutally. He doesn't let him have much time to talk to his replacement. He gives him a few hours and basically says, you're on a plane back to Pearl Harbor before sunrise. Out of here.
tell how Lieutenant General, Smith got his nickname?
Holland Mad Smith,
Yeah.
he got a previous, but he's a hothead.
he-
And he writes a really bad book post-war called Coral and Brass. I cannot recommend it. It's full of a lot of innuendo and bad behavior. People actually beg him not to write the book. We could go on a long time about him, but we don't have time today. Okay, so he's a problem. Let's put it that way. Okay, so anyway, so Smith flies out, right? Ralph Smith. And Ralph Smith goes to Hawaii. And they immediately hold a court of inquiry, an Army court of inquiry. And guess what? The Army exonerates him completely. All right. Well, now, the head of the Army in the Central Pacific, not MacArthur, he flies into Saipan, unannounced, uninvited, okay, and begins to hand out medals to soldiers in the 27th Infantry Division. This really infuriates not just the Marine Corps, but the Navy as well, because he's not supposed to be on this island. All right, so this continues to get worse and worse and worse. It gets all the way up to Admiral King and General Marshall in Washington. And they're like, oh, we don't want anything to do with this. Won't this just kind of go away? And unfortunately, the U.S. press gets involved with it. So now the U.S. press brings this up. And you see the Chicago Tribune is a big part of this, that the Marines have too many casualties, and this will go on later in the war as well, and that we should have no more, the Marine Corps basically should be disbanded, which will actually be attempted by the Truman administration in the late 40s. And this goes on and on and on. It's amazing that this thing just continues to be ugly. Okay. How ugly does it get? Okay. It gets so ugly after the U.S. press and this friction that we have problems in Korea. We have problems in Vietnam. We have problems in Grenada in 1983. Finally, in 1986, there's a thing called the Goldwater's-Nichols Act, mandates the creation of joint commands and doctrine. So we don't see that happening all the way until 1986. Of course, when we invade Panama, things are better. When we invade, of course, our fight in Iraq in the first Desert War in 1990, things are better. There's still a few problems with the Navy, but it's not nearly as bad as it was. So it takes 40 years for this thing to get over. It's amazingly bad. Now,
Bill Nichols is from this district, and there's a building on Auburn campus.
well, see, I didn't know that. Okay, so anyway, another point Dwight asked was about how did we fire generals so rapidly in World War II, particularly the Army firing generals that came from National Guard units. Those guys got whacked all the time because they really weren't performing. But today we don't hardly ever fire people like this. And I think I can't be sure of this. My opinion is simply this, that in World War II, we're in a life or death situation. Okay. We can't afford to lose World War II. And we look at people like in Vietnam, I mean, there's really never any worry that the Vietnamese are going to invade California. I mean, let's be honest, okay? And we look at Afghanistan and Iraq. And when you do this, you ruin somebody's career completely, okay? So I think we've become a lot more reticent to make these kind of drastic maneuvers simply because it's not as vital. And second of all, because it's so drastic of maneuvers for people's careers. I don't know that for sure, but that's my opinion. So hopefully that answers your questions. Well, now we're going to look at Marine forces. They're still moving up in Saipan. They're advancing northward. It's not going particularly bad. Again, the Japanese aren't particularly well organized, but on July 6th, the Japanese have realized they've come to the end of their rope. And they're going to have a thing called a Gyokusai, which is a shattered jewel, which we would refer to as a banzai charge. In other words, that military unit of the Japanese army is going to be destroyed. So indeed, they are never captured. That's the simplest way to put it. It's part of the Japanese cult of death. And they're going to take 7 lives from the emperor. Of course, they cannot really achieve that. Many of these people are walking wounded. They're in terrible physical condition. They don't have a lot of ammunition or weapons, but this is going to be their last charge. Again, so they aren't captured. Well, they do make this charge. They're basically annihilated. And indeed, the battle now is coming to an end. Well, the emperor, Hirohito, sends a message. Remember, there's 25,000 civilian Japanese on this island. And many of them are continuing to move northward with the army to avoid capture. And the emperor tells them, he says, by radio, of course, that if you civilians will fight to the death, that indeed I will enshrine you at Yasukuni. Now, what is Yasukuni? Well, we look at Arlington Cemetery as a key place for our war dead. Yasukuni has a much more religious aspect to that. To be enshrined at Yasukuni means that you will become a demigod and become part of a subsidiary to the kami, the gods of Japan, and that forever you will become a defender of the islands of Japan and the current emperor. So this is it's amazing that he would do this. Okay, quite honestly, he was advised not to, but he does make this decision. Another thing that goes on with this situation is that the people on this island are terrified of us. They have been told by propaganda forever that Marines will kill them. They will rape all the women and kill them. We will butcher the children. That a Marine, in order to become a Marine, actually has to kill his grandmother. Now, this is a society that holds, elderly in great respect. Okay, so basically, Marines are portrayed as monsters to these people.
Okay, also have to eat them rather than just.
I don't think they had to eat them. I'm not sure about that. But so think about this. So Hirohito basically says you civilians need to fight to the death, right? So approximately 1,000 Japanese civilians will commit suicide at a place called Marpi Point. It's sometimes referred to as Banzai Cliff or Suicide Cliff. I find that to be distasteful. I would prefer just be Marpi Point, where this tragedy will take place. Why does this tragedy take place? The Japanese are going to try to use this as propaganda in order to make us aware that trying to capture the Japanese home islands will be beyond our capabilities. And indeed, if we invade Japan, every Japanese, the term is 100 million die as one, but they don't have 100 million. But that's their number that they use. 100 million die as one in order to prevent the invasion of Japan's home islands. That's their propaganda message from this. Now, it's a difficult place. I mean, this is a picture that my wife took at Marpi Point in 2019. You can see those little people there. You can see how high this is. Yes.
So they committed suicide. They didn't help the war in any sense, except basis of propaganda.
They were right. Yes, it's basically a propaganda move. And the Japanese don't even know it's occurred. They build off of this later on after this event is put in the US press. But that's how terrorized these people are, that they literally would rather die. Now, what you can't see in this picture is behind this is a cliff, bunch of cliffs. And in those cliffs are a bunch of Japanese bunkers. You can still tour them if you choose. And what happened is some Japanese civilians would come to the edge, particularly families. They'd get to the edge and they'd say, well, maybe I don't really want to do this. And they would try to retreat. Many of them were shot down by Japanese troops in those bunkers. Now, we can't intervene because of the Japanese in that bunker. So we can't go in and stop these people from jumping in because indeed, and they actually do try at the end to try to stop some of them and they just jump anyway. They're just that terrified of us.
Off too, don't they?
Yes, they throw the children off. Yes. So 1,000 Japanese civilians will die at this place. And I look at this place when we were there as a place of incredible sadness and incredible shame for the Japanese government to have done this to their people. And I would say this to you, and you can see the memorials that are built by the Japanese to the people that died here. And these people all basically died because of propaganda and because of the request of the emperor. So I would ask you simply this: if you should ever go to Marpi Point, I would ask that perhaps you would clap your hands to get the attention of the spirits and say a prayer for these people who were propagandized that much in order to do this kind of thing. And with that, I thank you for coming today.